This is 7th Generation Warfare, and I'm your current host, John Nelson. In this episode, we'll be continuing to look at Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication Number 1, Warfighting. This episode, we'll be discussing initiative and response. All actions in war, regardless of the level, are based upon either taking the initiative or reacting in response to the opponent. Take the initiative. By taking the initiative, we dictate the terms of the conflict and force the enemy to meet us on our terms. The initiative allows us to pursue some positive aim, even if only to preempt the enemy initiative. It is through the initiative that we seek to impose our will on the enemy. The initiative is clearly the preferred form of action because only through the initiative can we ultimately impose our will on the enemy. And in 7th Generation Warfare, enemies could be really anything. It's forces in the future that will degrade or rob our descendants of the free exercise of their will. So by taking the initiative, we're what I'm doing here, what I hope you're implementing in your life as well, is taking the initiative, thinking cognitively about multi-generational parenting, what conflicts our kids might come to, how we can set them up for success to overcome those obstacles, what recurring themes they might come across, and how to instill in them the lessons so that they don't have to relive the mistakes that we may have lived, etc. All those things, thinking it out now and finding a way to implement it and teach it to our kids is taking the initiative. At least one party to a conflict must take the initiative, for without the desire to impose upon other, there would be no conflict. That's interesting. So, yeah, in violent warfare, there could be war where, you think of a fight. You may have witnessed fights or been in a fight where one person gets riled up and punches somebody, and the other person doesn't really want to fight. So there's one person imposing their will. They obviously have the upper hand and will probably win that battle because they took the initiative and punched the person in the face. But in war, violent war, there has to be somebody taking the initiative because if both people are okay with just how things are, there's no conflict. And so with 7th Generation War, with 6th Generation Warfare, I think with fighting the war within yourself, the spiritual war, you should hopefully get to a point where you don't feel like you need to impose your will on others. So in doing so, you can hopefully avoid war. Now, there might be people who still want to impose their will on you, and fighting a 6th Generation Warfare, you're hopefully learning how to position yourself in a way that you can avoid such aggressive people. And in 7th Generation Warfare, finding a way that you can protect your descendants from people who want to impose their will on them. If you have to move, you have to move. If you have to disassociate from people, you have to disassociate from people. Whatever it takes, just avoid the conflict. The second party to a conflict must respond, for without the desire to resist, there again would be no conflict. If we cannot take the initiative and the enemy does, we are compelled to respond in order to counteract the enemy's attempts. The response generally has a negative aim, that of negating, blocking, or counterattacking the enemy intentions. Like a counterpunch in boxing, the response often has as its objective seizing the initiative from the opponent. So, in violent conflict, if you don't have the initiative and you're in the response, you want to act in such a bold way that you get the initiative. So if somebody shoves you, in a bar fight, somebody shoves you, you want to be the person to punch them across the face and level them to the ground, because then you have the initiative. You can jump on top of them and keep pummeling them, or you leave if they're on the ground, whatever you have to do. But again, we're hopefully trying to avoid violent conflict. But it's about seizing the initiative. And so in 7th generation warfare, don't let time and complacency dictate what happens to your family. Take the action now. Start thinking now about what lessons, what troubles your descendants might get into, and take the initiative now. Because ultimately, there really isn't an enemy. It's our own complacency. So if you're just not complacent, you have the initiative. The flux of war is a product of the continuous interaction between initiative and response. We can imagine a conflict in which both belligerents try to take the initiative simultaneously. As in a meeting engagement, for example. After the initial clash, one of them will gain the upper hand, and the other will be compelled to respond, at least until able to wrestle the initiative away from the other. Actions in war more or less reflect the constant imperative to seize and maintain the initiative. So in violent warfare, if you have a small skirmish and your enemy flees the battlefield, well, you have the initiative. I mean, it could be that they're feinting you, or playing that they're weak and running away in order to lead you into an ambush. It could be, but you can presume that you have the initiative. And so if you just sit back and say, hey, we won, you're not capitalizing fully on that victory. If you pursue and continue to destroy them as they're running away, that's how you capitalize, and that's how you escalate that. Maybe first it's a skirmish, maybe next with a squad, maybe you pursue them, they lead you back to where their platoon is, you have a platoon on tack, platoon on platoon, they retreat, it escalates to a battalion, a company, a battalion, a regiment, division, and then maybe you win the war just by keeping that initiative going. This decision leads to a related pair of concepts, the offense and defense. The offense contributes striking power. We normally associate the offense with initiative. The most obvious way to seize and maintain the initiative is to strike first and keep striking. The defense, on the other hand, contributes resisting power. The ability to preserve and protect ourselves. The defense generally has a negative aim, that of resisting the enemy's will. But in full-on war, sometimes it's necessary to have defensive positions in some places because you are seeking to gain the initiative in others. And so you're putting your effort over here. The units over here just need to defend and resist any effort that comes at them. 7th generation warfare is kind of both offensive and defensive at the same time, in that you're offensive because you're working on improving the situation of your descendants, but it's defensive because you don't really know where or when an attack is going to come, and you're building. What you're ultimately doing is you're building defensive. You're building defensive walls, maybe by creating some family folklore. You're instilling some values by doing some ready side up stuff or prepping. You are building some defenses against some sudden misfortune and things like that. So it is both offensive and defensive at the same time. The defense tends to be the more efficient form of war, meaning that it tends to expend less energy, which is not the same as saying the defense is inherently the stronger form of warfare. The relative advantages and disadvantages of offense and defense are situationally dependent. Because we typically think of the defense as waiting for the enemy to strike, we often associate the defense with response rather than initiative. This is not necessarily true. We do not necessarily assume the defensive only out of weakness. For example, the defense may confer the initiative if the enemy is compelled to attack into the strength of our defense. Under such conditions, we may have the positive aim of destroying the enemy. Similarly, a defender waiting in ambush may have the initiative if the enemy can be brought into the trap, as I already discussed. The defense may be another way of striking the enemy. And I think that kind of pulls why 7th generation warfare is both offensive and defensive at the same time. It is defensive, but that's where the strength is in 7th generation warfare, that we are building our strong positions, and if any enemy attacks us or our descendants, they will be destroyed. That if we build strong enough defenses, we don't need to go on the offensive. While opposing forms, the offense and defense are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they cannot exist separately. For example, the defense cannot be purely passive resistance. An effective defense must assume an offensive character, striking at the moment of the enemy's greatest vulnerability. As Clausewitz wrote, the defense is, quote, not a simple shield, but a shield made up of well-directed blows, end quote. The truly decisive element of the defense is the counterattack. Thus, the offense is the integral component of the concept of defense. So if you're fighting conventional warfare and you're dug in foxholes and the enemy attacks you and you repel their attack, you want to counterattack. You want to strike them when they're running away. 7th generation warfare, could that be? I suppose it could be that you may need to go attack or counterattack, but by and large, hopefully you're strong enough that, a person, people, or forces, spiritual forces or just societal forces might attack you once, and then you effectively destroy them or repel their attack so effectively that they don't have a desire to attack anymore, because it'd be a waste of their energy to go after your family. I mean, that would be the ideal place to get. No one fucks with you. Similarly, the defense is, but if in 7th generation warfare, if you get so good and such strong defenses that no one's fucking with you, no one's messing with you, or your descendants might get weak. So that's something to watch out for, and that's something to plan, is how do you build that resiliency in? There needs to be some resiliency to your descendants so that they don't get weak, because when they're weak, they're complacent, and then the enemy creeps back in. Similarly, the defense is an essential component of the offense. The offense cannot sustain itself indefinitely. At some times and places, it becomes necessary to halt the offense to replenish, and the defense automatically takes over. Furthermore, the requirement to concentrate forces for the offense often necessitates assuming defensive elsewhere. Therefore, out of necessity, we must include defense considerations as part of our concept of offense. And so this is talking more about the last episode we talked about the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of conflict. And so if you're talking about needing to build in defenses, I think we're looking more at the operational or strategic level. The tactical level is more like the people on the offense or the people in the defense and how they're setting that up. But if you have, a battalion or regiment-sized attack, well, some units in that greater unit are going to have to take up some sort of defensive posture, and that's more operational level. This brings us to the concept of the culminating point, without which our understanding of the relationship between offense and defense would be incomplete. Not only can the offense not sustain itself indefinitely, but also it generally grows weaker as it advances. Certainly, moral factors such as morale or boldness may increase with the successful attack, but these very often cannot compensate for the physical losses involved in sustaining an advance in the face of resistance. We advance at a cost in lives, fuel, ammunition, and physical and sometimes moral strength, and so the attack becomes weaker over time. Enemy resistance, of course, is a major factor in dissipation of strength. Eventually, we reach a culminating point at which we can no longer sustain the attack and must revert to defense. It is precisely at this point that the defense element of the offense is most vulnerable to the offensive element of the defense in counterattack. So the culminating point is when you're crushing it, you're doing good offensive attacks, but you're growing weaker and weaker and weaker, and if you keep that up just a little bit longer, it's going to lead to devastation. So you got to pull back, reset, regroup, set up a defensive perimeter while you do, and replenish your supplies and your morale and things like that. It's kind of a good way to look at 7th generation warfare as the culminating point. It's there's no point fighting the other people. Our enemy is not flesh and blood, but principalities of darkness, right? So the battles we fight are within ourselves. We don't need to fight externally. Let's pull back. Let's find what we're doing wrong in our lives first in the 6th generation warfare, and then let's find out how we can set our descendants up for success so that they don't make those same mistakes or have to fight those same battles. We conclude that there exists no clear division between the offense and defense. Our theory of war should not attempt to impose one artificially. The offense and defense exist simultaneously as necessary components of each other. And the transition from one to another is fluid and continuous. Which is interesting because in training they did, this, platoon in the offense, platoon in the defense. If you're supposed to be in the defense and you said, hey, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1 says there is no offense or defense, I'm going to take the initiative because I think the other unit training for the attack just thinks that we're in the defense, and you go and schwack them. The training forces in the military would not like that very much. I do not think so. The military does not always train how it fights. They like to say they do, but they don't. These relationships between initiative and response, offense and defense, exist simultaneously at various levels of war. We may seize an initiative locally as part of a larger response in a limited counterattack, for example. Likewise, we may employ a tactical defense as part of an offensive campaign, availing ourselves of the advantages of the defense tactically while pursuing an operational offensive aim. So that was Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication number 1, Initiative and Response. I think that one was pretty valuable. I hope you are enjoying this content, and I hope that you will continue to watch. We are not even halfway through Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, and I'm already starting to scan the next book for content. So stay tuned. Thank you.